You speak to people, particularly Americans, and they think it's undemocratic, whereas Australians think it is democratic. Compulsory voting is that if you're a citizen of Australia, you have an obligation, a legal obligation, to turn up to a polling booth on election day or organise a postal vote and get your name crossed off the electoral roll. The countries that Australia compares itself with, the United States, Britain, Ireland, Canada, New Zealand, none of these have compulsory voting. It's not common. Australia legislated for compulsory voting in 1924. With compulsory voting, it meant that the government was supported by the majority of the voters, not just the majority of people who turned up. Where you don't have compulsory voting, political parties have to motivate their supporters to actually take the trouble to go to the polling booth and vote. That means they can be tempted towards much more extreme political issues, whereas because everybody has to vote, in a way it pulls politics towards the centre. When Donald Trump was elected in the United States and Britain had its vote on Brexit, lots of people in Australia comforted themselves with the thought that because we had compulsory voting, that sort of more populist result, which is how people in Australia saw it, was much less likely to happen because everybody has to vote. In systems with voluntary voting, the people less likely to vote are people who are poorer, less well educated, people from new immigrant groups. Now, that means that the politicians, when they're touting for votes, know that all of the groups, including the poor, are going to have a vote. And I think that makes for a more egalitarian public policy. The third advantage is that when an immigrant becomes a new citizen, they also acquire the obligation to vote. And that means they get drawn into the political system, whether they like it or not. So you don't get immigrant groups who, in a sense, stay a bit apart from the mainstream politics. Most of the objections were practical. How much should we fine people if they don't vote? Won't there be too many people who don't vote, and so it'll be an administrative burden having to follow them up? Compulsory voting has widespread popular support in Australia. There's very little opposition to it. Occasionally you'll get a politician putting a libertarian argument against it, but it doesn't have much traction.